Thanks very much. Everybody enjoying the conference so far? Find it interesting? Well, bear in mind I'm the only civil servant presenting, so let's just reevaluate those expectations a little bit. So, morning everyone. I hope you are enjoying. My name's Jamie Trollope. I work as a research manager at DVLA. I'm going to talk about a few ways that we've really embraced customer insight into what we're doing. Hopefully provide some ideas about why you should think about introducing these activities in your organization, or if you're already doing these things, perhaps refine the process, learn from some of the mistakes that we've made. So we've got about 30 minutes, I think. I'm going to try and cover a number of things, so namely research in agile environments, some examples of methodologies that we use, particularly usability testing and customer journey mapping, some of the practicalities around these, and hopefully if we've got enough time and you're still interested enough, some questions. So, everybody's here to DVLA, right? Yeah. Well, so I'm not going to cover this in a huge amount of detail then, but I will let the marketing guys know that they're doing a bang-up job. DVLA's remit is to register drivers and vehicles, maintain that database of 46 million drivers, 37 million vehicles, collect vehicle excise duty, road tax, and issue the various bits of documentation that supports all that, such as your driving license. So all of that amounts to 3 7.5-ton trucks delivering paper applications, and that is about 500,000 a week. But more importantly, for the purposes of this presentation, here is DVLA's vision. So customers are at the heart of our business. They drive everything we do. Our digital services and our people exceed customers' expectations. And we've also been set a target to achieve 80% digital take-up for 80% of our services by 2020. Now, those are pretty massive numbers when you think about it. We've got 46 million driver records, 37 million vehicles. That is a huge challenge. And without spending the time to invest in customer insight, to really understand who our customers are, what they need, is going to be extremely difficult to achieve. So for many of the projects that we're going to do to shift our existing services onto a digital platform to meet that target is the Agile method that we're using. So this presentation isn't entirely about Agile, so I'm not going to spend a huge amount of time on this, but hopefully people are aware of these headings. But in a nutshell, the 4 stages of an Agile project development are up there. So the process is centered around fast iteration and refinement of prototypes with regular development leading up to launch of a product. So at each stage, there are certain questions we should be asking. So in the discovery phase, when this is in its inception, if you like, we've got what are the needs of the user? What services do we currently have that meet those needs? And what, in the wider context, are the technological or policy constraints that we need to be working with? So before you start building a service, you need to build up a picture of what the context for that service is. That means lots of user research, close analysis of existing policies, business needs, and understanding the wider user requirements. So there are a number of activities that we can conduct at this point to really understand the as-is process, how customers currently interact with that service, and what their expectations for a future digital service might be. This is particularly where we're coming from in DVLA, as I said, trying to get a lot of transactions online. So we've got traditional surveys, focus groups, both internally with stakeholders, externally for user requirements, customer journey mapping. A lot of you will be familiar with process mapping or service blueprints, which are a really valuable resource in and of themselves, but I'm going to spend a bit more time later on talking about CJM, customer journey mapping, and how it's significantly different from those things. So we're on to the alpha phase. So by now, we are continuing to build upon and analyze the research that we've commissioned on user needs from discovery, and using this to set up an open engagement process with stakeholders and customers. We'd be looking to involve a wide range of stakeholders from private, voluntary, charity sectors, other government agencies, and run a series of workshops with these stakeholders to develop options and eventually a working prototype. And again, there's some really simple but effective things that we can do at this point. So, card sorts, for example. We know exactly what information needs to be on a website or on a new transaction portal, but having this information categorized and segmented on a series of cards, just asking customers or stakeholders to put it in the order they find most logical, that's a really quick, cheap, effective means to get a basic framework of how information should be displayed. Similarly, designers and developers should be encouraged in this phase to come up with a number of early concepts for the new service, and these can be tested internally within your company with stakeholders again, or with customers at this point. And some early difficulties or problems can be eliminated right off the bat. Usability testing involves getting customers to interact with a prototype of a new product and observing their progress, and there'll be more detail on this in a few slides. So by the beta phase, we already know a lot about the service and how it's going to work in practice. The objective of this phase is to build the fully working prototype and then test it publicly with users. So you'll continuously improve on the prototype until it's ready to go live, replacing or integrating with any existing services. And this is achieved by providing the user stories in the backlog created in the alpha phase. And this is the time to resolve any outstanding technical or process-related challenges, get the service accredited or approved by whoever needs to do that, and then plan for it to go live. So with the fully working prototype, usability testing continues. By now, most of the large defects are going to be eliminated, and the look and feel is going to be pretty close to what it's eventually going to end up as. But there's always room for improvement. There's always finishing touches that can be made. You can also roll this out to a larger but still limited sample. With usability testing, we are typically observing 6 to 12 people interacting with the product at a time. But by now, the code is evolved enough that it can be released to a limited sample of hundreds or thousands of users using real data. And this volume testing in conjunction with quantitative feedback, so something as simple as a linked survey at the end of each transaction, that's really going to give you a good indication of how this is going to perform once live. And then finally, it does go live. But as it says on the slide here, that's not the end of the process. The service should now be continuously improved based on user feedback and further research. The feedback function in the beta can still be used here. Some products will have millions of transactions a year, so you could code a feedback survey to appear on every 1,000th transaction, and you're still going to have a huge sample size with which to look to find those improvements. This can also be linked with analytics, which will track referrals, click-throughs, performance in real time, and social media. Hashtag analysis, mentions on Twitter and Facebook, these are all tools that we can use that will tell you more about how this service is performing in the real world. So hopefully you can see that there's a wealth of information and insight that we can provide, but for the next 20 minutes or so, I'm going to focus on discovery and alpha phases and two particular methodologies, usability testing and customer journey mapping. So what exactly is usability testing? So hopefully I'm not telling people things they already know, but this is in the context of what we're using it for and the services that we're trying to get online. So in any web design or web-based product, there's three key areas. Well, there's a lot more than that actually, but for simplicity's sake, let's stick to these three critical ones. The content of the site, quite obviously, has to be factual, informative, and enable the user to complete whatever they're doing without ambiguity. Secondly, the technology has to support it. The platform should be free from defects, quick, reliable, efficient, and most importantly, do what it's supposed to do. And then the third element is usability, but it links very strongly in with the first two. So it's great that your content is factually correct, all the information is contained within a couple of pages, but what if the customer can't find that information? Or what if they don't understand it when they have found it? Similarly, the technology might be fantastic. It could be capable of some really brilliant things, like linking databases from here to there, taking a payment, whatever. But what if it's difficult for the customer to use? What if it's not intuitive and the customer starts getting frustrated to the point where they just abandon this transaction and forget about it? Then you've actually got nowhere. So in a nutshell, usability is the effectiveness and the efficiency of a system to meet the user's needs, resulting in user satisfaction and productivity, and that's where we're coming from. So why usability testing? And in truth, this question could be asked of any of the insight activities I've talked about, particularly when you think about DVLA. I mean, in many respects, we've got a monopoly on our element of the market. I mean, if you want car tax, you've got to come to DVLA. But that isn't good enough for the customer. We've still got to have services that are usable, meet their requirements, and exceed their expectations as well. And there's also the elephant in the room from DVLA's perspective. As I mentioned earlier, 80% digital take-up, 80% of our services by 2020. I don't think anyone here thinks that's going to be an easy task, but without being customer-focused and understanding exactly what the customer needs and how they use their service, we're not going to get anywhere near that. So remember our current state. We're dealing with 500,000 paper transactions per week at the moment, so I hope that gives an idea of the size of the transformation that we're talking about here. Here's an example of a recent usability test we conducted on the customer portal of View My Driver Record project, which is very snappily titled. But the product is actually a really good one, I think. Anyway, it's going to provide an online portal where the customer can securely access and view all of the information that DVLA hold for them in regard to their driving license. So it's going to have your personal details, what vehicles you're entitled to drive, how many penalty points you have on your license, all of that kind of thing. Now, this lady has been set during the test a pretty simple task on the face of it. All we wanted her to do is to check whether she can drive a car. Perhaps she needs to show evidence that she's entitled to drive this particular type of vehicle to a new employer. She's lost her license. That's the kind of situation that this product is being developed for. So by this point, she's logged onto the portal. She's had no issues whatsoever. She's found the entitlement screen, no difficulty there. And although the screen, you'll see, will have full entitlement and provisional entitlement, so vehicles she can drive under certain conditions, what she really needs to do is just click the link in the middle of the screen that says, show me more full entitlements. And that is going to give her the car, and that's exactly what she needs. But what she's really doing is clicking just about every single link on that page, except the one she wants. She just, for whatever reason, doesn't see that that's there. So at this point, you know, time's going on, she's starting to get a little bit frustrated. You can see in her demeanor, and having failed to do, the task, in effect, the facilitator asks, so what would you do if this was a real-life situation and you're at home? What would you do now? I'd probably just ring up. So not only is this product not delivering what it's intended to do, it's actually generating work for us. It's creating calls that we don't want or need at this point. And given that the projection for this is that it's going to take up to 6 million inquiries a year, if even 1% of people found that same issue and took the same action, then that's going to have obviously an enormous impact on our call center, on casework back at the office. So hopefully that's illustrated how a simple design issue that could easily have been overlooked was identified in usability testing and then potentially avoided a big impact down the road because it's been fixed in newer versions. And the key to this is that usability testing doesn't have to be complicated and it doesn't have to be expensive. Okay, so how do we make sure that we use usability testing successfully? The Agile process is, by its very definition, fast-paced, rapidly changing, and evolving through iterations. And that iterative process is critical. We take a product, we test it, we gather feedback, we develop it, and then we test it again. And that's exactly the structure that we have at the moment. So the developers provide us with the prototype or the latest version of the product. Anyway, in the second week of the month, we conduct a test of this version with customers. The footage and the feedback is collated, fed back to the project team. Following that, the developers may have a number of user stories to concentrate on and refine to resolve some of the issues identified in the test. That new version is developed and released, which we test again. And it literally can be that quick to gather this incredibly useful customer feedback. And the reason it's that quick is because we keep it simple. You know, at DVLA, we have got a number of things to help us. We've got a contract in place with a recruitment company to source participants for us based on our specifications which can be as loose as just any customer in effect, or they can be quite tight in that we need somebody who's got a particular entitlement to drive, of a particular age, with a certain amount of internet experience. The upfront work that we do in the discovery phase about understanding our customer segments allows us to be very focused in our testing so that we know the people who are helping us to develop it are the people who are going to use it in the long run. We also have got some software that allows us to record the customer as they're using the system. That's what you saw a minute ago. It tracks their mouse movements, click rates, time on task, where they're viewing the screen, and a whole load of other really cool stuff. And we've recently begun streaming these tests live back to the developers. So wherever we are in the country, because we take this testing out with us to get a much wider kind of geographical and social demographic sample, they are still able to see that feedback live, which is a really powerful thing to be able to do. And we've managed to get a structure in place which allows us to be quite slick in delivering this insight. But really, at the heart of it, the principle is just keep it simple. Usability testing involves setting a series of tasks for people and noting any problems they encounter, and that's it. But one thing that we do try to encourage participants to do is to think out loud, and we ask the participant to verbalize their thoughts as they're progressing through a task or a scenario that we've set them. And whilst this is admittedly a little bit artificial, it's the most efficient way of finding the reasons why they're doing what they're doing whilst using the system. And the point of verbalizing is really to do these three things. Now, if I was talking to somebody who was going to start doing usability testing for the first time and they had very little resources, these are the three key phrases that I would give them: thinking, feeling, doing. And I would suggest that just hitting these three things is probably going to take you about 80% of the way through a successful user test. And the reason for that is because what a customer's thinking reveals their motivations. So I think I need to go here because I need a tax disk. And what they're feeling is the context which frames their experience. So I hit that link and it didn't take me through to get a tax disk, so I'm starting to get a little bit frustrated now. And then what they do is, as a result of that, is key, because those are the behaviors that we want to try and change or encourage or start, or whatever the case may be. So in that example, I really can't find what I'm looking for now, so I think the best thing is just to close this down and give somebody a ring. That's the behavior that we want to discourage when developing a successful online product. So I've talked a lot about usability testing there. What about the other methodology I mentioned up front, customer journey mapping? In many ways, it's quite similar to user testing in that it's a qualitative methodology. It's best conducted with small samples and looking to really explore the thoughts and feelings behind behaviors. So what exactly is CJM? So it's important to get across that this presentation isn't about mapping, is about mapping as opposed to maps. There's a great company that we've done, that I've linked in with before, called Adaptive Path in America, who have just explained this in a way that really made it simple for me. So one of the things that we learned is that when you end up at the end of a customer journey mapping session with a fairly spectacular journey map that has got different swim lanes by channel and dozens of different kind of touch points, I'm going to go into some reasons shortly why that element of it isn't as valuable as the process of going through the mapping itself. And there's a couple of things that customer journey mapping can look and sound like, but they're in fact very different. And the simplest way of describing this is the inside out versus outside in principle. So this is one of our internal process maps or service blueprints, or a number of other names that you could call it, but it's basically a description of an organization saying this is what we do and this is how we do it. So we get a bit of paper that comes in here, goes to this department who do some stuff to it, and then it goes out the other side. It's very kind of personal to individual organizations, and it's their internal means of doing things, and it's a very inside-out view. And the purpose of these internal maps is to describe how a service works. So they're useful to show the characteristics of interactions in enough detail for an organization to verify that activity, implement it, and maintain that service. But something like a journey map is outside in. It shows the journey of a customer through various touch points they may have with a company and describe the experience of a customer when interacting with that company. I know that distinction might seem obvious when you talk about it in those terms, but unless you know exactly which one of these two things you're going to do, the results that you get at the end are going to vary drastically, and what you can do as a result of those is going to vary as well. So a journey map describes how a service is experienced through different touch points that characterize that customer's interactions. So when I was preparing for this presentation, I was trying to think of the best and simplest metaphor to describe the difference between these activities and those people, for those people who may not be familiar with the terms, and this is what I've come up with. So, how many people have heard of Tough Mudder, the endurance event? Anybody? Yeah, well, for those who haven't heard of it, Tough Mudder is a 12-mile endurance event. It's kind of like Ironman. I recently completed the Northwest one, not far from here. So a metaphor I'm using at the moment to describe the inside-out versus outside-in principle is when you think about journey mapping, think about Tough Mudder. So stay with me on this, it'll make sense. This is the course map of the event. It shows you the route that you need to take, process that you need to go through. There's the start, there's the finish. You follow the path from A to B. It's very clear, it's very linear, it's an inside-out perspective. And that's fantastic in its own right. It tells you exactly where you need to go to get through this process. But I would argue that hasn't really told you anything about the experience of going through that process. That's me. I'm all kind of full of hope, optimism. My number is written on my forehead and my arm in permanent marker, in case the one on my chest is ripped off in what can only be described as the horror to come. And then I'm chest high in mud. You like this one? I'm crawling through water, I'm getting electrocuted. It's a pretty funny picture. And I'm running through mud, I'm swimming through ice water, crawling through submerged tunnels, and eventually I'm finishing looking like a broken man. And you'll notice under the layers of mud that I'm actually missing a shoe. That came off with about a mile to go, so that was fun. But the point of this is that it's only through understanding the experience that you get a full picture of what it's like to go through those various touch points. The process view, the course map is not enough for that. So how exactly do we start to understand the experience that customers are having with our services? So, firstly, we need to think about exactly what we mean when we use the term touch point. A couple of people have talked about that already, and here's a definition. A touch point is a point of interaction involving a specific human need in a specific time and place. So in our context, what we've really got is a customer with a motivation or a series of motivations. At every point in their journey, they need something, and that could be a product, it could be information, whatever. And we've also got an organization which has got products or services that seek to satisfy that need. And where the two meet, we have an interaction and a touch point between the two. So then, touch points are the same as channels, right? Well, not really. Touch points can take place across multiple channels, and I think that's an important point to make. I mean, in this example, the customer wants to apply for a driving license, and that application touch point can take place over any of those channels and indeed across them. And this is one of the key points of journey mapping for me. Get everybody involved. Get people from all across the business in a room and ask them to walk through a transaction from a customer's perspective. This is something that's going to be difficult for some people, and the challenge for you guys is to get them engaged in that process. But luckily for you, there's a presentation called Getting People to Do Stuff today. So after this, it'll be a doddle. The key is that the organization should start looking from a customer perspective and feel what it's like for customers to interact with them. Getting your stakeholders to identify the touch points in a transaction is a good way to start doing this. And it gets people talking about their own area of the business in potentially a completely different way than they have before. And this is one of the reasons why I said earlier that the actual physical map that you end up with at the end isn't it's brilliant, but it's the activity of mapping with both stakeholders and customers that is the real value here. I'm a huge believer in keeping things simple. So you take the journey that you're looking at, break it into segments, and there can be a lot of divergence that a customer goes through to satisfy their requirement at each particular point, but it can still be broken into stages. So if they want information, they can go online, telephone, pick up a leaflet, or whatever. But that information gathering stage is still just one step on the journey. Again, this goes back to what I was saying about touch points happening across channels. And then you want to start looking at the touch points a customer may experience whilst going through that transaction. So as we've just covered, it's really important to walk through that journey with people within the business. And in a lot of cases, that new perspective can be enough on its own to start identifying pain points, wastage, efficiency saving, and so on. But you get even more if you just talk to your customers, which is, radical thinking, I know. So these are the most important stages for a customer, are the moments of truth that we call them. So these are the points where they're having a great experience or they come to a decision point because they're so dissatisfied, then they could make the decision to just abandon what they're doing. And just identifying these and working on these is going to give you a great benefit anyway. And then finally, tell the story. By now, the business is going to have an idea of what it's like for the customer using your services. But now you can really let them know, especially if you add some rigor to your process by allowing the outputs of your one-to-one interviews with customers to start informing something like a larger sample survey. If you mix that qualitative and quantitative work, you're going to get a really rich insight into what it's like for customers actually using your services and those suggestions for improvement, of course. And that's really the final key point. The journey mapping exercise should not be a conclusion. So many times I've seen fantastic research being done, some beautiful journey maps up on walls, or presentations being given back to stakeholders, and they've all said, that's great, and we work on it. But then really nothing actually happens. So with journey mapping, it should be a catalyst to change within the organization, not a conclusion in itself. So how do you make sure that it is a catalyst and not a conclusion? So immediately work with stakeholders to start identifying solutions. And as it says on the slide there, it's usually, not always, but in 4 areas, which are people and service issues, environment, the product itself, or communications around it. And although the efficiency savings you can make through these solutions are obviously valuable enough, it's quite interesting that some of the benefits of doing this kind of exercise don't necessarily impact on the customer directly. I mean, you can save money by doing this just simply by virtue of the fact that satisfied customers cost less. They don't call your call centers as much, they don't make complaints as much, and all of that kind of thing. Delivery improves because you've identified wastage through organizational planning. You can prioritize the changes in the longer term. You can build consensus across departments and encourage that collaborative thinking that's so important, and spot the opportunities in the marketplace to improve what you're doing or whatever. So, covered quite a lot there in actually a relatively short space of time, but these are the things that I'd like to leave you with. Test often and fail often, particularly with usability testing. I can't stress enough the importance of being able to test with customers through a development cycle. Find the failures quickly and often, refine it, test it again. Make sure you're testing with the right customers. It's not going to give you a huge amount of value if you are developing your product with customers who have absolutely no intention of using it in the future. So identify your target market, speak to the right people. Capture everything. Most everything that a customer says is, when they're using your service, is valuable information. At DVLA, we use a host of software and various different things, but really there's nothing wrong with a note taker and a pen, or a dictaphone or a video camera, whatever your budget is, is going to allow you to do, whatever's appropriate. Incentives is a question that every organisation is going to have to answer for themselves. I mean, a lot of customers will be happy to offer feedback for free, but I mean, if you're asking them to come in, talk to you for upwards of an hour about your product, then you may consider covering their travel time, paying them an incentive. That's a question for yourselves, really. Don't be afraid of negative feedback. When you talk to your customers, they're not always going to be telling you what a fantastic job you're doing. A lot of the time they probably will. But whether they're telling you how great something is, or they're telling you how much frustration it's caused, all of that is valuable insight that you can collate and act upon. Finally, be rigorous and do your homework. Going back to that Tough Mudder example, I actually needed that course map up front. I needed to know the lay of the land before I could find out what those experiences were like, which were horrible, by the way. Find out who your customers are. Look at survey results, metrics, demographic information, all of that stuff combined with some of these techniques is going to give you a fantastic holistic picture and the opportunity to improve your organization. So that's it from me. I hope you found it useful. I hope it's given you some ideas or some tips, or really this has been a lot about learning from mistakes that we've made. But thank you all for listening very patiently. So I think we've got some time for some questions.